Emily sat in her dimly lit apartment, her only company the faint hum of the refrigerator and the flickering light from her computer screen. It was Halloween night, and while her friends were out partying in costumes, Emily had chosen to stay in. The isolation, the quiet, it suited her more. But even as she scrolled mindlessly through her social media feed, a gnawing sense of unease tugged at her. A week ago, she'd stumbled upon the advertisement lurking at the bottom of an obscure website she couldn't even remember visiting. Halloween Mystery Box Unboxing. The message was simple: pay a small fee, receive a box with a mystery surprise. It could be candy, a toy, or something special the site had promised. It was gimmicky, yet the ominous phrasing hooked her. Open at your own risk. Her finger had hovered over the Buy Now button longer than it should have, something inside her resisting, warning her. But curiosity, or perhaps something darker, had won. She clicked, entered her payment details, and now, sitting before her on the small coffee table, the box had arrived. It was small, plain, and brown, with no return address, no indication of where it had come from or what was inside. There was no hint of excitement in its appearance. In fact, it looked forgotten, abandoned, like something that should have never been sent. Emily's stomach churned as she glanced at the sticker on top. Do not open until midnight. She checked her phone. 11:57 p.m. Her thumb absently swiped across the screen, refreshing the time over and over, watching the seconds pass by with growing tension. The apartment felt still, too still. Outside, the usual sounds of the city, honking horns, distant conversations, were absent. It was like the world itself was holding its breath. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, her fingers drummed nervously on the arm of her chair. This was ridiculous, she knew. It was just a box, a silly marketing gimmick meant to play on people's fears. But why did it feel different? Why did her chest tighten with each passing second? The clock struck midnight with a soft chime. She didn't move at first. Her hands stayed frozen in her lap, her breath held in anticipation. For a brief, irrational moment, she hoped nothing would happen, that maybe the box would just disappear, taking with it the strange weight that had settled in her bones. But it didn't disappear. It sat there, silent, waiting. She leaned forward, her fingers shaking slightly as they reached for the tape sealing the top. The adhesive gave way with a soft, almost reluctant rip. As she pulled back the cardboard flaps, a wave of cold air seemed to escape, brushing against her face and sending a shiver down her spine. Inside, cradled by black tissue paper, was a doll. Not just any doll, a porcelain one, old and worn, its painted face faded and cracked in places. Its eyes, wide and lifeless, stared up at her, glimmering in the dim light. The doll's small hands rested delicately in its lap, dressed in a once white lace gown, now yellowed with age. There was something unsettling about it, though she couldn't quite put her finger on why. Maybe it was the way its glass eyes seemed to follow her every movement. Emily swallowed hard, resisting the urge to push the box away. She'd expected something playful, something silly, a rubber spider or a cheap Halloween trinket. But this felt wrong, too personal, too real. Her heart pounded in her chest as she noticed a small tag hanging around the doll's neck, tied with a frayed red string. She lifted it gingerly, squinting to read the words scrawled in faded ink. "Do not look away." Her breath caught in her throat. The message, though simple, sent a jolt of fear through her. It felt like a warning. Emily laughed nervously, trying to shake off the creeping dread. This was just a game, right? A Halloween scare. They probably wrote that on all the boxes to freak people out. She could imagine the team behind the marketing, sitting in some office laughing at how easily people like her would fall for it. But still, the doll's painted eyes glinted in the light, unnervingly lifelike. Emily set it down on the table and stood up, crossing the room to get some distance between herself and the box. Her hand fumbled for her phone, and she absently refreshed her messages, hoping for some distraction. The screen remained stubbornly blank. Her apartment, once her sanctuary, suddenly felt claustrophobic. The shadows in the corners seemed darker, the silence thicker. She caught herself glancing over at the doll, almost as if expecting it to move. It sat there, motionless, but something about it felt different. Maybe it was the tag, maybe it was the cold air that still lingered around her, or maybe it was the way her skin prickled with the unmistakable feeling of being watched. As her nerves began to fray, she forced a laugh. "It's just a doll," she whispered to herself. "Get a grip." But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted the moment she opened the box, like the room itself had changed, or maybe something in the air had grown heavier. Her phone buzzed in her hand, jolting her out of her thoughts. The message was from her friend Megan. Happy Halloween. Anything spooky happening? Emily stared at the message, fingers hovering over the keyboard. She considered telling Megan about the doll, but stopped herself. It sounded stupid, even in her own head. Instead, she typed a quick response. Not much, just chilling. She put the phone down and took one last glance at the doll. It was still sitting there, still staring, but the unease it stirred in her hadn't faded. There was a part of her that wished she had never opened the box, a part of her that wondered what might have happened if she hadn't. And then, from the shadows of the room, she thought she heard something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a faint whisper carried on the air. It was so quiet that she wasn't sure she'd heard anything at all. But the doll seemed different now. Its head had tilted just slightly, as if listening. Emily stared at the doll, her heart hammering in her chest. She could have sworn its head had tilted slightly, just enough to give the eerie impression that it was watching her. A trick of the light, she told herself. Her mind was playing games after the unsettling arrival of the box. Halloween had always been her favorite night of the year, but now that thrill was turning into something far more sinister. The apartment was too quiet. Her breath felt loud, filling the stillness as the weight of the doll's presence pressed down on her. She hesitated, considering putting it back in the box. Just pack it away and forget this whole thing. But before she could reach for it, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Another tag tied around the doll's wrist, half hidden beneath its lace gown. Her stomach knotted as she leaned closer to read it, the faint light barely enough to make out the words, "Do not look away." The same warning, the same command, as if the doll itself were telling her to obey. She rubbed her temples, trying to push down the growing sense of dread. It's just a stupid Halloween game. A cheap scare. But that didn't explain the way her skin prickled, or why the room suddenly felt so cold. A chill slid down her spine, and she crossed her arms tightly around herself, her eyes fixed on the doll. Emily's phone buzzed on the table, startling her. She grabbed it quickly, grateful for the distraction. Another message from Megan. "You all right? You're being kinda weird tonight." She wanted to reply, to tell Megan everything, But how could she explain this strange feeling without sounding insane? She hesitated before typing back, "I'm fine, just tired. I think this Halloween box thing is getting to me." Before she could hit send, she heard a faint sound, like the soft shuffle of fabric moving across the floor. Her fingers froze above the screen. Slowly, she lifted her head, her pulse quickening. The doll. It hadn't moved, but it felt like it had. Her body tensed, every nerve on high alert as she stared at it. The longer she looked, the more the shadows around it seemed to shift, like the room was breathing in time with her fear. She shook her head, trying to break the spell. This was ridiculous. She wasn't a child anymore, jumping at the sight of a creepy toy. But just as she was about to turn away, she saw it again, a subtle flicker of movement in the corner of her eye. The doll's head. It had moved. A strangled gasp escaped her throat as she stumbled backward, nearly knocking over the lamp beside her. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts as her eyes locked onto the doll. Its lifeless eyes, those cold, painted orbs, were now staring directly into hers, unblinking. This wasn't possible. Frantically, she reached for her phone again, trying to call someone, anyone, but the screen stayed stubbornly dark. The battery had been full just minutes ago, and now it was dead. Panic clawed at her chest. She needed to get out. She needed to leave, to throw the doll away, to scrape. The sound echoed softly through the room, like something dragging itself across the floor. Her gaze snapped back to the doll, now sitting just an inch closer than before, its cracked porcelain fingers resting unnervingly against the table's edge. The cold silence thickened around her as she took a shaky step back. The shadows seemed to swell, creeping up the walls and twisting into dark shapes she couldn't quite define. Was this really happening? Was the doll actually moving on its own? Her rational mind screamed at her to stop, to snap out of it. It was just a toy, nothing more. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. Something was wrong. Terribly, deeply wrong. She could feel it in the air, pressing down on her chest like invisible hands. Her eyes drifted back to the box. Maybe if she just put the doll away, closed it up, and left the apartment, this nightmare would end. She inched closer to it, her legs trembling with every step. Her hand hovered over the doll, reluctant to touch it. The smooth porcelain felt cold against her fingertips as she reached out. Tap, tap, tap. Emily froze. The tapping came from behind her, near the window. Her head whipped around, eyes scanning the room frantically, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, just the silence. She turned back to the doll. Its head was fully turned now, tilted to the side as if it were watching her every move. A crooked smile had cracked its face, a subtle shift, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. The lights flickered. Her breath hitched in her throat as a shadow passed over the doll, distorting its face in the gloom. And then she heard it, a faint, barely audible whisper. Emily. The voice was soft, raspy, like it was crawling up from the depths of a dark, endless tunnel. She felt her heart stutter, her legs weakening beneath her. Number. No, this wasn't happening. She spun around, trying to find the source of the voice, but she was alone. Wasn't she? Emily? The voice came again, closer this time, curling around her like icy fingers. She backed away, her eyes wide with terror. Her thoughts were spinning, her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The walls seemed to shift, closing in around her as her breathing quickened. She had to get out. Now. But something caught her eye. The journal. It was lying at the bottom of the box, hidden beneath the tissue paper she hadn't noticed earlier. The cover was old, the leather cracked and stained, as if it had been touched by countless hands over many, many years. And there, scrawled across the front in faded gold letters, were the words that made her blood run cold. "Do not let it out." Her fingers trembled as she reached for the journal, her mind screaming at her to stop, to leave it alone. But she couldn't. It was as if the book was calling to her, drawing her closer, pulling her into its secrets. She opened it. The pages were yellowed, brittle with age. The writing inside was hurried, desperate, as if the author had written in a frenzy. Each entry became more frantic, detailing the same doll she now had sitting in her apartment. The same warnings, the same whispers. The final page was smeared, barely legible, but she could make out enough to understand. "I made a mistake. I looked away. It's out now, and once it's out, it doesn't stop. It won't stop until it takes someone." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The room grew colder, the shadows pressing in around her. She felt it now, the presence in the room. Watching. Waiting. And then, just as she lowered the journal, she heard it again. "Emily." The doll's eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dark, its head cocked unnaturally to the side. The smile on its face had widened, its porcelain skin cracked, flaking. The whisper was louder now, more insistent. "Emily, you looked away." Her legs gave out and she sank to the floor, the journal slipping from her hands as the room spun. The shadows closed in around her and she knew she had let it out, and now there was no escaping it. Emily sat on the floor, her back pressed hard against the wall as she stared at the journal lying open in front of her. The air was thick and suffocating, as though something unseen was pressing down on her chest. The whisper still lingered in her ears, circling her mind like a predator playing with its prey. "You looked away." Her body trembled, cold sweat slicking her skin as her eyes darted nervously between the journal and the doll. The doll remained perched on the table, its wide, glassy eyes staring directly at her, its cracked smile frozen in time. But she swore its face looked different, more malicious, as though the very act of her reading the journal had fed it something, made it more alive. Her hands trembled as she reached for the journal again, desperate for answers but terrified of what she might find. She flipped back through the brittle pages, the ancient paper crinkling beneath her touch. The words were frantic, erratic, as if scrawled by someone in the grip of overwhelming fear. It began with the whispers. The author had written that line over and over, their hand clearly shaking as the ink smeared across the page. The entries described strange occurrences, objects moving on their own, sounds in the middle of the night, soft tapping, whispers in the dark. The doll always seemed to be at the center of it all, like an object of fixation for something far worse than a child's toy. "It watches you when you're not looking," one entry read. "If you look away even for a moment, it will move. It will grow stronger." Emily's breath caught in her throat as she read that line. It felt like the journal was speaking directly to her, confirming her deepest fear. She had looked away, twice now, and each time the doll had moved closer. Her pulse quickened as she read on, the pages filling her mind with dread. "I thought I could destroy it, burn it, bury it, anything to stop what was happening. But the doll, it's not just an object, it's a vessel. Something uses it, something watches through it, feeds off fear. And once it's let out, It will not stop until it has taken what it wants. Emily's mind raced. She had opened the box, let the thing into her apartment. But what was it? Was it the doll itself, or something worse, something trapped inside it? The pages offered no clear answer, only the frantic ramblings of someone who had clearly been pushed past the edge of sanity. You cannot destroy it, the journal warned, but you can contain it. The rules are simple. Do not look away. Do not listen to its whispers, and under no circumstances ever should you let it touch you. But then, as if to mock her fear, the doll moved. Just a fraction, but enough. Its head tilted further to the side, and the smile on its cracked lips seemed to widen. The air in the room shifted, colder now, oppressive. Emily's breath quickened, coming in shallow gasps as the room seemed to close in on her. She could hear the faintest rustle of fabric, like the soft swish of the doll's lace dress shifting ever so slightly against the wood. She knew she shouldn't look away. The journal had warned her, and the consequences were all too real. But every instinct in her body screamed at her to run. Get out. Leave this place. She could almost feel the weight of the doll's gaze pressing against her, seeping into her skin. Her phone, still lifeless and dead, offered no escape. No one was coming to help her. Emily forced herself to turn the page, her shaking hands smudging the faded ink as her eyes skimmed the next entry. The handwriting was jagged, almost illegible, as though the author's hand had been trembling so violently they could barely control it. It waits until you're weakest, the entry read. It knows when you're afraid, when you're alone. That's when it will make its move. That's when it will take you. Her breath hitched. How could it know? Was it watching her now, feeding off her terror? Her mind reeled, heart pounding in her chest as she tried to make sense of it all. Her skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, the awareness that she wasn't alone. The doll didn't just sit there anymore. It felt like it was biding its time, watching her with an almost predatory patience. Then, as she turned to the last page of the journal, she found the final, chilling entry. The ink was smeared, blood-stained in places, and the words were barely readable, but they were enough. If you're reading this, it means you've opened the box. I'm sorry. I was too late. The doll, it's not the end. It's just the beginning. What comes next? No one survives. Emily's hands flew to her mouth, stifling a scream. Her eyes darted toward the doll, now impossibly closer than before. How? She hadn't looked away. She swore she hadn't. But there it was, mere inches from the edge of the table, its porcelain feet just barely touching the floor. The whispering began again, low and distant, yet somehow still surrounding her. Emily ... Her name spoken in a rasping voice that sent chills down her spine. It wasn't just in her head anymore. It was here, in the room, with her. Emily ... Her pulse thundered in her ears. She couldn't stay, she couldn't face it. But the journal had warned her. Leaving wouldn't help. The creature, the thing inside the doll, was already out. Running wouldn't save her. The only question left now was what it wanted. Another scrape, louder this time. Her head snapped to the doll, but it hadn't moved. Not visibly. Its eyes seemed to gleam in the dim light, more alive than ever. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. Emily, it's time. Her vision blurred as the weight of the whispers closed in on her mind, suffocating her thoughts. She wanted to scream, to run, but her body wouldn't obey. All she could do was sit there, frozen in fear, as the thing inside the doll began to stir. It was waiting for her to break. Then, with a cold certainty, she understood. It wasn't just the doll. It had never been just the doll. The journal was right, it was only the beginning. The creature lurking inside had always been there, waiting for someone to look away, to listen to the whispers, to give in to their fear. And she had. The last flicker of light from the lamp sputtered out, plunging the room into darkness. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she felt it, something cold, something tangible, move toward her. And then she saw it. A shadow rising from the doll, taller, darker, with hollow eyes that gleamed in the darkness. Its smile was wide, jagged, and full of hunger. It whispered again, louder this time, right beside her ear. "You let me out?" The darkness wrapped itself around Emily like a living thing. It breathed against her skin, cold and suffocating, as if it had a pulse, rhythmic, steady, waiting for her to falter. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each exhale clouding the air in front of her face. She couldn't see the doll anymore, but she knew it was there, somewhere in the room, watching her. No, it was watching her, the thing that had been hiding inside it, waiting for its moment to break free. Emily's body trembled uncontrollably as the soft whisper of fabric echoed from the corner of the room, like something delicate shifting in the shadows. Her heart raced, pounding in her ears as her mind fought against the reality unfolding before her. She wanted to scream, but no sound would come. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like they had been rooted to the floor. Every instinct screamed to move, to flee, but she couldn't tear herself away from the oppressive weight of the creature's presence. The room seemed to pulse with a darkness that was thicker than mere shadow, alive with an unnatural energy. She could feel it drawing closer, even though she couldn't see it. The air growing colder with every passing second. The creature, the thing that had once been trapped inside the porcelain doll, was free now. And it was hungry. A scraping sound, louder than before, filled the silence. Emily's eyes flickered wildly toward the source. In the dim light, she could just make out the doll's outline, sitting there unmoving, yet still so very wrong. But it wasn't the doll that terrified her anymore. No, the doll had served its purpose. It had been the key to something far worse. From behind the doll, a shadow unfurled. At first, it was just a flicker, like the darkness itself had come alive. But then it grew, taller, broader, until it filled the corner of the room, swallowing what little light remained. The shadow had form now, a shape that twisted and elongated, its edges wavering like smoke, but its presence solid, undeniable. Hollow eyes glowed from within the darkness, deep, endless pits that bore into her, hungry and knowing. They were fixed on her, devouring her fear. A jagged grin split through the shadow, wide and unnatural, stretching far too wide for any human face. Emily's chest tightened as she realized it wasn't just a shadow. It was something more. It was a creature, a thing that had crawled from the depths of nightmares, now standing in the room with her. No longer confined to the doll, no longer just whispers in the dark. Her breath hitched as it took a step forward. A long skeletal hand stretched from the darkness, the fingers too long, too sharp as they reached toward her. The air around her grew colder still, her breath fogging in the icy chill that seemed to seep from the creature's very presence. Emily ... The voice was not a whisper anymore. It was deeper, fuller, dripping with malice. It echoed in her mind as though it came from every corner of the room at once. She pressed herself harder against the wall, her fingers digging into the plaster behind her as if she could disappear into it. Her mind raced, trying to remember the warnings from the journal, but her thoughts were clouded by fear. The creature had been released and there were no more rules to save her. The creature took another step, its grin widening, the hollow pits of its eyes glowing brighter. It seemed to revel in her terror, feeding off it, growing stronger with every heartbeat. Emily could feel it pulling at her, drawing the very essence of her fear into itself, making it more powerful, more real. In the corner of the room, the doll remained motionless, its once lifeless eyes dull and empty now, like a vessel that had been drained. It no longer mattered. The doll had been just the beginning. "You shouldn't have looked away," the creature hissed, its voice slithering through the air like poison. The grin stretched wider, impossibly wide, as it reached for her again, the long, bony fingers brushing against her arm. Emily's skin burned where it touched her, ice cold but searing at the same time, like her very soul was being scorched. She let out a choked gasp, her body seizing as the pain spread through her like wildfire. The creature's touch was like death itself, cold, inevitable, final. Her mind screamed at her to move, to fight, to do something. But what could she do against this thing? It wasn't bound by the same rules, wasn't something that could be reasoned with. It was darkness, hunger and terror made flesh, and it wanted her. "You let me out," it rasped, stepping closer until it loomed over her, its face mere inches from hers. The stench of decay and rot filled her nostrils, suffocating her. The hollow eyes gleamed with dark amusement, as if this was all a game, one it had already won. Emily's breath came in shallow, ragged gasps. Her body felt numb, drained of warmth, as though the creature was stealing every bit of life from her with each passing second. She tried to speak, tried to beg, but the words wouldn't come. The cold was spreading deeper now into her bones, into her very soul. The creature's grin widened, its jagged teeth glinting in the faint light. It leaned closer, its voice a low, hungry growl. "It's time to come with me." Emily's vision blurred, her body growing weaker by the second. The darkness was closing in now, enveloping her completely. She could feel it, the pull of the creature, the weight of its presence crushing her. It wasn't just a thing of the shadows anymore. It was real. It was here, and it was taking her. Her thoughts spiraled, a desperate plea rising in her mind as she fought against the inevitable. "I'm sorry." But it was too late. She had let it out, and now there was no going back. The last thing Emily saw before the darkness swallowed her whole was the creature's hollow, glowing eyes, and the jagged smile that stretched wider and wider, as though it would consume the world. The room fell silent. The doll sat still on the table, its purpose fulfilled, its glassy eyes staring vacantly into the emptiness. The shadows receded, pulling back into the corners of the room, quiet once more. And the creature was gone, but the door had been opened. And somewhere, in the silence that followed, another whisper stirred. Who will open the next box? The streets of Elm were a living postcard on Halloween night. Leaves crunched beneath feet as children in costumes paraded down the sidewalks, their laughter carrying through the crisp October air. Ghosts and ghouls, superheroes and princesses, all eager for the one night they could live in a world of make-believe, collecting candy as they went. It was the perfect blend of excitement and mystery, and for the parents who followed a few steps behind, it was all too familiar. Every year, the same routine. Every year, the same joy. But not this year. Lily McAllister, standing on her front porch, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had lived on Elm Street for most of her life, and Halloween had always been her favorite night. Yet, there was a strange stillness in the air this time. The streetlights flickered more than usual, and the soft hum of excitement that normally filled the air felt muted. Her son, Ethan, tugged at her sleeve, pulling her from her thoughts. "Mom, come on. I don't want to be late. Everyone's already out there." His voice was full of impatience, muffled slightly by the skeleton mask he had insisted on wearing. Lily knelt down to adjust the mask, her fingers brushing his messy brown hair. "Are you sure you don't want me to come with you? It's a big night, lots of houses. We can go together." Ethan groaned, rolling his eyes. "I'm not a little kid anymore. I'm going with Sam and Lucas. We're gonna hit the whole neighborhood. Please, Mom." She hesitated, her heart conflicted. He was right, he wasn't a little boy anymore. At 12, Ethan was growing up fast, faster than she was ready for. But there was something in the pit of her stomach that made her uneasy tonight. It wasn't the usual motherly worry. No, this was different. A cold, creeping dread she couldn't explain. Finally, she relented, forcing a smile. "All right, but you come home as soon as you're done, okay? No wandering around late." Ethan nodded eagerly, already bouncing on the balls of his feet in anticipation. "Thanks, Mom. I'll be back before you know it." Lily watched as he bounded down the front steps, joining his friends under the glow of a flickering streetlight. The three of them merged into a small cluster of kids moving from house to house, their figures fading into the night. The usual rush of children began to fill the street, and for a moment Lily let herself relax. "It's just Halloween," she told herself. "Nothing ever happens in this town." But as the hours ticked by, that hollow feeling in her chest only grew worse. By 8 o'clock, Lily had started pacing the living room. She'd heard the doorbell ring a few times and smiled at the little monsters and witches asking for candy. But the crowd was smaller this year. The constant stream of trick-or-treaters seemed thinner, quieter, as if the night had somehow lost its magic. She checked her phone for the third time in 10 minutes. Still no messages from Ethan. She told herself not to overreact. He was probably just having fun with his friends, maybe getting a little more candy than he should. Nothing unusual. And yet, her phone buzzed, startling her. It wasn't Ethan. It was Rachel, one of the other moms on the street. The message was short, but enough to send a chill through Lily's spine. "Is Emily with Ethan? She hasn't come home yet, and I can't reach her." Lily's fingers hovered over the screen, her heart rate spiking. She quickly texted back, "I haven't heard from Ethan either. Have you checked with Sam's parents?" The reply came almost instantly. "Yeah, nothing. They're calling the police." The police. That's when it became real. Lily grabbed her jacket, slipping it on as she dialed Ethan's number. It rang once, twice, then straight to voicemail. She tried again. Nothing. The same empty silence greeted her on the other end. Her breath quickened as she stepped out onto the porch, scanning the street for any sign of the kids. But the once busy sidewalks were eerily empty. A few houses still had lights on, decorations glowing faintly in the distance, but most were dark now, curtains drawn as the night grew older. Where were they? They couldn't all be missing, could they? The sound of distant shouting caught her attention, pulling her out of her daze. She hurried down the street, her feet moving faster than her thoughts. Several parents were gathered at the corner, their voices tense, panicked. As she approached, she could see it in their faces, the same fear she felt gnawing at her insides. "I can't find Josh anywhere," one mother cried, her voice shaking. "He said he'd only be a few blocks away." "They're all gone," another parent muttered, his face pale. "How can so many kids just disappear?" Lily's heart hammered in her chest. It didn't make sense. Kids didn't just vanish in a quiet town like theirs. But the reality was sinking in now. This wasn't a prank or some misunderstanding. Children were missing. She glanced around, her eyes darting to the shadowy edges of the street. A sense of wrongness settled over her, thick like fog. The usual warmth of the town, the safety she had always felt here, was gone. In its place was something sinister, something that felt cold and ancient, as if the night itself had swallowed the children whole. Desperation clawed at her. She pulled out her phone again, her hands trembling as she typed, "Ethan, where are you? Call me now, please." The message sat there, unsent, stuck in a loop of failure. No signal, no connection. The wind picked up, rustling the trees overhead, and she thought she heard something faint. A child's laugh, carried on the breeze. But it was distant, almost too faint to be real. She turned toward the sound, her breath catching in her throat. Could it be Ethan? Before she could move, the streetlights flickered and went out, plunging Elm Street into complete darkness. In the hours that followed, chaos erupted in the town. Parents flooded the streets, calling out their children's names, some banging on doors in desperation. The police arrived, setting up search parties and questioning anyone who had seen the kids last. But the answers were the same. No one had noticed anything unusual until it was too late. And as the night stretched on, Lily's fear turned into something far worse. A gnawing, suffocating terror that whispered in her ear, "They're not coming back." But the question remained. Why? Why would an entire group of children simply vanish without a trace? No signs of struggle, no calls for help. It was as if they had walked off the edge of the world and into the dark. Standing on her porch again, Lily felt the weight of the silence pressing in. She stared down the empty street, hoping for any sign of life, for the laughter of children to break through the horror of the night. But there was nothing. Only the endless stretch of shadows and the growing certainty that something had come for them. Something old, something hungry, and it wasn't done yet. That night, Lily didn't sleep. Neither did the rest of the town. Something had changed on Elm Street, and Halloween would never be the same again. The panic had spread like wildfire through Elm Street, enveloping the entire town in a suffocating fog of fear. The parents, once hopeful, were now frantic. The search parties, scouring the streets and woods, returned empty-handed each time. But as the hours slipped by and Halloween night crept into the dark unknown, whispers began to circulate. It started small, just fragments of conversation, overheard in the hushed exchanges between neighbors. The old house, the one on the edge of town, had come up more than once. People spoke of it as if they were afraid to even acknowledge its existence. Some said it had been abandoned for decades, while others claimed it was still occupied, but not by anyone who belonged in this world. Lily heard the rumors, of course, but she didn't want to believe them. She wanted to cling to some rational explanation, that the kids had wandered too far, or that they were hiding out somewhere together, waiting for the right moment to come home. But deep down in the corners of her mind, where the cold truth lingered, she knew there was more to this. More than lost children. More than a simple search. It was the house. She stood at her kitchen window, staring out at the distant horizon where the town ended and the woods began. Beyond those trees, in the darkest part of the forest, was the house. As a child, she had heard the stories, but like most kids, she had dismissed them as silly ghost tales meant to scare you before bed. But now, she wasn't so sure. The front door creaked open, startling her from her thoughts. Paul Montgomery stepped inside, his face pale and drawn. His daughter, Emily, had vanished along with Ethan and the others. Like Lily, he had been searching every corner of town, but it was no use. They had both come to the same conclusion without speaking it aloud. There was only one place left to go. "You heard the rumors, right?" Paul asked, his voice low, barely above a whisper. Lily nodded. "I've heard, but it's just stories, and isn't it?" Paul's jaw tightened, and for a moment he didn't answer. He stared at the floor, the weight of his own fear heavy in his expression. "I don't know, but I can't just sit here and wait anymore. We have to check it out." A lump formed in Lily's throat as she glanced back toward the window. The house felt like a bad dream she had forgotten, now reawakened by the horror unfolding in front of them. Every instinct screamed for her to stay away, to wait for the police to handle it. But the police weren't any closer to finding the children, and time was running out. She couldn't risk it. "I'll go," she said, her voice firmer than she felt inside. "We'll check it out together." The drive to the edge of town was unnervingly quiet. As they left the neighborhood behind, the streetlights grew fewer and farther between, until the town itself seemed to fade into the rearview mirror. Paul gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the leather, while Lily sat in the passenger seat, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. They had brought flashlights, though neither had mentioned what good they might actually do. The house was rumored to be more than just haunted. The stories whispered about something older, something dangerous. But in the thick of her fear, all Lily could think about was Ethan. If there was any chance, any possibility that he was inside that house, she had to go. The trees thickened as they neared the edge of town, and soon the headlights caught glimpses of the house through the branches. There it was, nestled in the heart of the woods, an ominous silhouette against the dark sky. It was bigger than Lily had imagined, its old Victorian frame crumbling under years of neglect. The roof sagged in places, and the windows were boarded up with weathered planks. But even from this distance, she could feel it. The house exuded a presence, something malevolent, as if it was aware of their approach. Paul pulled the car to a stop, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. The engine idled, its soft hum the only sound in the oppressive silence. Finally, Paul spoke, his voice hoarse. "You sure about this?" "No," Lily whispered, "but I'm not leaving until we know for sure." They stepped out into the cold night, the crunch of dead leaves beneath their feet echoing too loudly in the quiet. The flashlight beams cut through the darkness, but only barely. The shadows seemed to cling to the trees, to the ground, like they belonged there. The house loomed ahead, every inch of it radiating a deep, unnatural darkness. As they approached, the air seemed to grow heavier, colder. It wasn't just the chill of the night, it was something else, something that made Lily's skin prickle and her breath come shallow. She glanced at Paul and she could see the same fear mirrored in his eyes. The front door, once painted white, was now chipped and faded, hanging slightly ajar as if it had been waiting for them. Paul pushed it open with a creak, revealing a long, narrow hallway that stretched into the depths of the house. Dust motes floated through the air, and the smell of rot and decay hit them instantly, almost suffocating. Lily swallowed hard, stepping inside. The floor creaked under their weight, each step an unnerving reminder of how fragile everything felt here. Old paintings hung crooked on the walls, their subjects faded and indistinct, but their eyes seemed to follow her every movement. The farther they ventured, the more disoriented Lily felt. The house wasn't just old, it was wrong. Rooms appeared where they shouldn't. Doors that had been closed were suddenly open, leading into unfamiliar spaces. The shadows moved strangely here, twisting in ways that defied logic. They turned a corner and Lily's heart lurched into her throat. There, lying on the floor, was a familiar object, Ethan's candy bucket. Its contents were spilled across the floor, the brightly colored wrappers in stark contrast to the decaying interior of the house. Lily dropped to her knees, picking it up with trembling hands. "He was here," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Ethan was here." Paul knelt beside her, his face grim. "Emily, too. Look." He pointed toward the far wall where another candy bucket lay abandoned, half hidden in the shadows. They weren't imagining things. The children had been here, inside this house. But where were they now? A sound broke the silence, faint but unmistakable, a child's laugh. It was distant, echoing through the hallways, yet somehow hollow. Lily's head snapped up, her heart racing. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul nodded, his face pale. "It's coming from upstairs." The two of them exchanged a look of pure terror before rising to their feet. They followed the sound, their footsteps heavy against the creaking floorboards. The stairs loomed ahead, a steep, narrow staircase that led into the upper levels of the house. The laughter grew louder, but it wasn't right. It was twisted, distorted, like someone had taken the sound of children playing and warped it into something else, something wrong. As they reached the top of the stairs, the laughter stopped, replaced by a deep, unsettling silence. The hallway stretched before them, lined with doors that seemed to go on forever. They glanced at each other, uncertainty and fear gripping them both. Then one of the doors at the end of the hall creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness beyond. Lily's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped forward, her flashlight trembling in her hand. The air here was thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was alive, watching, waiting. They moved down the hall, closer to the open door, when something cold brushed against Lily's arm. She gasped, spinning around, but there was nothing there, just shadows. Endless, creeping shadows. The door at the end of the hall swung wider, beckoning them in. "We have to go in," Paul whispered, though his voice was shaky. Lily nodded, though every fiber of her being screamed for her to turn and run. But they couldn't. Ethan, Emily, and the others. They were here, somewhere inside this cursed place, and the house wasn't going to let them go without a fight. They stepped through the doorway and into the darkness, the house swallowing them whole. The darkness inside the house was absolute. Lily and Paul's flashlights struggled to cut through the oppressive blackness that seemed to press in from every direction, swallowing the narrow beams of light. It felt as though they had stepped into another world, one where time and space were distorted, where the familiar rules of reality no longer applied. Lily's heart raced in her chest, her pulse loud in her ears. The air was different up here, thicker, colder and damp, as though the walls themselves were breathing, exhaling something ancient and foul. She had to remind herself to breathe, to keep moving forward despite the overwhelming urge to run back down the stairs and flee the house altogether. Paul was beside her, his face pale, jaw set with determination. But even his steady presence couldn't chase away the feeling that they were being watched, that something unseen was following their every step. Every creak of the floorboards, every soft whisper of wind through the broken windows felt loaded with malicious intent, as though the house itself had become aware of them and wasn't pleased. They moved cautiously down the hallway, the door they had entered closing with an eerie finality behind them, leaving only a suffocating silence in its wake. As they passed by each door, Lily couldn't help but notice how they seemed to shift slightly when she wasn't looking. One moment a door was closed, the next it would be slightly ajar. And there was a growing sense that behind those doors something was waiting. Suddenly the air around them seemed to pulse, a low hum reverberating through the walls. Lily stopped, gripping Paul's arm. "Do you hear that?" He nodded, swallowing hard. "It's like a vibration." But it wasn't just a vibration. It was a presence, unseen yet unmistakable. The hum grew louder, rising and falling like a heartbeat, slow and deliberate. It echoed from the walls, from the floor, from somewhere deep within the house. Something was alive in this place, something powerful and malevolent. Lily's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment the hallway seemed to stretch impossibly long, the walls warping and twisting as though the house was reshaping itself around them. She blinked, and everything snapped back to normal, or what passed for normal in this nightmare. "We need to find them," Lily whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. "We're running out of time." Paul nodded, his eyes darting nervously to the nearest door. "This place, it's like it's alive. I don't know what we're dealing with, but it's not natural." Before Lily could respond, a loud crash echoed from somewhere down the hall, followed by the unmistakable sound of children's laughter, high-pitched and distorted, as if it were being played through an old, warped record. The sound sent shivers down Lily's spine. It was Ethan. She knew that laugh anywhere, but something was wrong with it. The laughter held no joy, only malice. Without thinking, Lily bolted toward the sound, her flashlight shaking in her hand as she ran. Paul called after her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The laughter was drawing her in, tugging at her heart with the cruel promise that her son was close. She had to find him. The hallway twisted and turned in ways that didn't make sense, leading her deeper into the house's labyrinthine interior. The walls seemed to close in, and every door she passed felt like it was watching her, its unseen occupant waiting just beyond the threshold. Finally, she reached the end of the hall. A door stood before her, old, wooden, and slightly cracked open. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a deep, heavy silence that pressed against her like a physical weight. Paul caught up to her, breathing hard, his flashlight beam bouncing nervously around the room. "What are you doing?" he hissed, his voice tight with panic. "You can't just run off like that." Lily didn't answer. She reached for the door, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold wood. She pushed it open. The room beyond was enormous, much larger than it should have been based on the exterior of the house. It was a ballroom, or at least it had once been. Now the grand room was a decaying ruin, the floor warped and cracked, the ceiling sagging with age. Pale moonlight filtered in through broken windows, casting long shadows across the floor. But it wasn't the state of the room that made Lily's blood run cold. It was the children. They stood in the center of the room, motionless, arranged in a circle. Ethan was among them, his skeleton mask still on, his small frame unnaturally still. Beside him were Emily, Sam, and the other children who had disappeared. Their eyes were open but vacant, like they were looking right through her. They weren't themselves. They weren't anything. "Ethan!" Lily cried, rushing toward him, her voice breaking with desperation. But the moment she stepped inside the circle, the air shifted, heavy with unseen forces. A low hum vibrated through the room, and Lily felt something brush against her skin, cold, intangible, like fingers made of smoke. Paul grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "Wait, something's not right." And then they heard it, a voice, deep and slow, reverberating through the room as if it were coming from the walls themselves. They belonged to the dark now. Lily froze, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The voice was low, inhuman, dripping with malice. She turned, her flashlight flickering, and saw it. A figure, cloaked in shadow, standing at the far end of the room. Its form was indistinct, like it was made from the very darkness around it, but its presence was undeniable. It was ancient, powerful, the source of the malevolent energy that filled the house. Lily couldn't move. Fear gripped her so tightly she felt like she couldn't breathe. Paul stood beside her, his face pale with terror, but they were both helpless. The figure shifted, its long, shadowy arms extending toward the children. "They are mine now, an offering." "No!" Lily screamed, surging forward despite the crushing weight of the unseen force pressing down on her. But the air around her thickened, slowing her movements, pulling her back. The figure raised one hand and the room seemed to shudder in response. The walls groaned, the floor creaked, and from the shadows whispers began to fill the air. Hundreds of voices, overlapping in a language neither Lily nor Paul could understand. It was as though the house itself was speaking, its malevolent energy pulsating with each word. Suddenly the children's eyes shifted. Slowly, almost mechanically, they turned their heads to look at Lily and Paul. But their eyes were no longer empty. They were filled with something dark, something ancient. Paul stumbled back, his breath ragged. "We need to get out of here," he gasped, his voice barely audible over the growing cacophony of whispers. But Lily couldn't leave, not without Ethan. She fought against the unseen force holding her back, her eyes locked on her son. His hand twitched just for a moment, and she thought, maybe, just maybe, he was still in there, still fighting. The shadowed figure moved closer, its presence warping the very air around it. The darkness that surrounded it seemed alive, tendrils of shadow stretching out, ready to claim them all. Lily screamed Ethan's name one last time, and in that moment, the figure stopped. The room fell silent, the whispers vanishing as quickly as they had come. For a brief, terrifying second, everything was still. Then, without warning, the candles lining the walls blew out, plunging the room into pitch blackness. Lily's world collapsed into chaos. The darkness was absolute. Lily could hear nothing but the rapid thudding of her heart and the shallow, panicked breaths escaping her lips. The room, the children, the towering figure, all of it had disappeared in an instant, swallowed whole by the oppressive blackness that now pressed in from all sides. She felt Paul's hand grip her arm, a silent reassurance that he was still with her. but even that was faint comfort against the overwhelming terror that had taken hold. It was as if the very air in the house had turned to stone, weighing down on them, squeezing the life out of every breath. Then, through the suffocating silence, a sound, soft at first, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. "Mom?" It was Ethan. Lily's heart lurched. She spun in the direction of the voice, her trembling hands outstretched, desperate to find him in the darkness. "Ethan," she cried, her voice breaking with both hope and fear. "I'm here. I'm right here." But the blackness remained unyielding, and Ethan's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, echoing through the room like a distant, ghostly refrain. "Help me." The voice was weak, fragile, as if it were slipping away. Lily's desperation surged, and she clawed at the air, stumbling forward. Her flashlight was dead, the beam extinguished, and it felt as if she were moving through molasses, every step heavier than the last. The room itself seemed to stretch impossibly far, bending and twisting as though reality had unraveled completely. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone out, the dim light returned, flickering like the last breath of a dying flame. The ballroom was still there, though now even more grotesque, more decayed, as if centuries had passed in the span of moments. The children remained in their circle, their heads bowed, eyes dull and lifeless. Ethan stood among them, still as stone, his small frame almost lost beneath the shadows that clung to him. But the figure, the thing, was closer now, so much closer. It loomed over them all, taller than it had been before, its shape flickering at the edges as if it were made of smoke and shadow. Its face, or what passed for a face, was hidden beneath a dark hood, but its eyes glowed faintly, cold and ancient, like embers burning in a pit of black coal. Lily could feel its gaze on her, piercing through her skin, her bones, her very soul. "You can't have him," she screamed, her voice raw and wild. "You can't take my son." The figure didn't speak, but the air vibrated with a dark energy that rippled through the room, carrying with it the unmistakable sense of finality. This was the end. The offering was complete. There was no escape. Lily's chest tightened, the realization crashing down on her like a wave. Ethan wasn't just lost, he was trapped, bound to this place by forces she couldn't understand, forces older and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Her son, her beautiful boy, was no longer hers. He belonged to Dida. But deep inside her, beneath the fear and the sorrow, something stirred. A mother's primal rage, a spark of defiance. "No," she whispered, her voice shaking but resolute. "No, I won't let you take him." With trembling hands, she stepped forward, closer to the circle of children. The figure shifted as if it were surprised by her audacity, but Lily didn't care. She wasn't leaving without Ethan. She couldn't. "Ethan, baby, look at me," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I'm right here. I'm not going to leave you. Come back to me, please. Come back." For a moment, nothing happened. Ethan stood motionless, his eyes vacant, his face blank. But then, slowly, impossibly, his head lifted. His gaze met hers, and in that single fleeting moment, she saw it. The spark of recognition, the glimmer of her son fighting through the darkness. "Mom." His voice was barely more than a whisper, but it was enough. Lily lunged forward, her hand outstretched. She grabbed his small, cold hand, her fingers closing around his as if she could anchor him back to her, back to reality. "I'm here," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm right here." The figure let out a low, rumbling sound, something between a growl and a hiss. The air around them grew heavier, charged with the weight of its fury. The house trembled, the floor beneath them cracking, splintering as the darkness pressed in from all sides. But Lily refused to let go. She held onto Ethan with everything she had, her grip tightening as the world collapsed around them. "You can't have him," she said through gritted teeth, her voice filled with a fire she hadn't known she possessed. "You won't all have him." The figure raised its arms, and the shadows swirled around it like a storm, ready to consume them both. But something shifted, just for a moment. The dark energy faltered, and the grip of the house loosened ever so slightly, as if Lily's defiance had pierced through the very heart of the evil that held them captive. Ethan's hand tightened around hers. "No!" the figure hissed, its voice sharp and jagged, full of rage and desperation. The shadows writhed, but they no longer felt invincible. The house itself seemed to scream, as if it were coming apart at the seams, unable to maintain its twisted hold on reality. In the chaos, Lily felt a strange sense of clarity, of understanding. This thing, this presence, it wasn't invincible. It thrived on fear, on darkness, on the souls of those who gave themselves up to it. But love, defiance, hope, these things weakened it, fractured its power. It couldn't take what wasn't willingly given. Ethan's eyes, still clouded by whatever darkness had consumed him, flickered again. And then, with a strength that defied everything around them, he stepped forward, out of the circle, into his mother's arms. The figure let out a howl, a sound so inhuman, so filled with fury and anguish that it seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. The walls groaned, the floor splintered, and the shadows writhed violently, collapsing inward as if they were being pulled into some unseen vortex. And then, with a final, deafening crack, the house shattered. Lily awoke to the sound of birdsong. Her body ached, her mind foggy as she blinked against the soft light filtering through the trees. She was lying on the forest floor, her arms still wrapped around Ethan, who was breathing softly, his body warm against hers. For a moment she didn't move. She couldn't. The weight of what had happened, the horror, the fear, the unimaginable darkness settled over her like a heavy blanket. But it was over. Slowly she sat up, pulling Ethan closer. He stirred, blinking groggily, his eyes clearing as he looked up at her. "Mom?" Her heart clenched. "I'm here, baby," she whispered, kissing the top of his head. "I'm here." Around them the forest was quiet, peaceful. There was no sign of the house, no decaying structure, no shadowy figure, no children's laughter. It was as if it had never existed, as if it had been erased from the world the moment its power had been broken. Paul was nearby, sitting up slowly, his face pale but alive. Emily was with him, her small body curled against his side, safe. The other children, too, were stirring, disoriented but unharmed. They had made it. Lily looked up at the sky, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the trees, and felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in so long. Hope. But deep in her bones, she knew the darkness wasn't truly gone. Not forever. It was out there, waiting, watching, biding its time. And one day it would return. But for now, she had her son, and that was enough.